We're going to take a look at skeletal muscle structure in this lecture. There's three different types of muscle. We have skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. The difference between these, skeletal muscle is striated or striped, and you can see that striated pattern here in this picture on the right. And it's under voluntary control because it's innervated by the somatic nervous system. Smooth muscle is called that because it looks smooth. There's no striations or stripes on it. And it's under involuntary control because it's innervated by the autonomic nervous system. And then cardiac muscle is a cross between skeletal muscle and smooth muscle. So you're going to see characteristics of both of those. So it is striated like skeletal muscle is, but it's under involuntary control like smooth muscle is. So it's innervated by the autonomic nervous system. So both muscle cells and neurons are excitable cells, and they can both generate action potentials. But the action potentials have very different effects in neurons versus muscle cells. So remember that the action potentials in neurons are going to be used for communication. So that'll stimulate the neuron to release the neurotransmitter and then talk to whatever the target cell is. But in the muscle cells, the action potentials that are generated in those cells will be used to cause contraction. So they both produce action potentials, but used for very different purposes. So let's take a look at the structure of skeletal muscles. And the muscle cell is also called a muscle fiber. And the reason that is because the muscle cell will run the whole length of the muscle. So they're very long, skinny cells, and they look like a fiber or a rope. So that's how they got their other name, muscle fiber. And remember, the tendons are going to connect the muscle to the bone. And let's just take a close-up look here. So if we look inside of our muscle, we've got these bundles of muscle cells or muscle fibers that are going to be held together by connective tissue to form what's called a fascicle. So this whole thing is a fascicle made up of many individual muscle cells or muscle fibers. And sticking out here, we've got one individual muscle cell that would run the whole length of the entire muscle here. And then packed inside of this muscle cell, we've got lots of these myofibrils, which are just the bundles of the contractile proteins that are actually going to cause the contraction. And then the other thing that you want to notice about this muscle cell is that it's multinucleated. So there are multiple nuclei here, which is very different from what you've learned about other cells, in that other cells just have one nucleus, right? So what happens during development as a fetus is that lots of muscle cells will fuse together and form these long, skinny muscle cells. And that's how they end up with multiple nuclei, because a number of cells will fuse together. So that's how they become multinucleated. And then we're going to just change the names of some things. I'm sorry they do this, but the sarcolemma. The sarcolemma is just what we're going to now call the cell membrane of the muscle cell. So sarco, that means flesh or muscle, and then lemma means covering. So sarcolemma is just talking about the cell membrane or plasma membrane of the muscle cell or muscle fiber. And then what the sarcolemma will do, and we'll look at a picture here in a minute, is it forms these little tunnels or T-tubules that will dive deep down into the muscle cell. And they will surround the bundles of contractile proteins, the myofibrils. And we'll talk about their function a little bit later. And then we have the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which you've already learned as the smooth ER. So we're now calling the smooth ER in muscle cells, that's now called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And its job is to store and release calcium ions. And the calcium ions are going to be needed for contraction. That's pretty important. Okay, and then we have the sarcoplasm, which you might have guessed is actually the cytoplasm of the muscle cell. And we have lots of mitochondria in skeletal muscle cells because they're going to generate lots of ATP to power the muscle contraction. And we do have glycogen stores in the skeletal muscle cells because remember the glycogen is stored in skeletal muscle cells and then also in the liver. And when the muscle starts to contract and we initially need to get some glucose to start making some ATP before the blood gets delivered, we can just start breaking down the glycogen stores to do that. The neuromuscular junction is where the somatic lower motor neuron will synapse with the muscle cell. And then we have the myofibrils, which are just a bundle of contractile proteins, the actin and the myosin. So the thin filaments, that's the actin. And then the thick filaments, that's the myosin. So the way that I remember these is that actin, if you look at the end, tin almost looks like thin, it's just missing the H. So if you remember that, it almost looks like thin. You can remember actin are the thin filaments. And then I remember that myosin are the thick filaments because thick is a longer word or a thicker word than thin. I don't know, I just have to make up little stories to remember these things. So let's take a look at some pictures here. So here we've got part of a skeletal muscle cell. It would actually run the whole length of this muscle. Cardiac muscle cells and smooth muscle cells are much shorter. And we just have one nucleus in the cardiac muscle cell and the smooth muscle cell. But the skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated just because they are so long, and several cells have fused together to form these skeletal muscle cells. Okay, and then just looking at a skeletal muscle cell or a muscle fiber here, we've got the sarcolemma or cell membrane on the outside. And then on the inside, if we look inside here, you can see these little holes, and diving down in here, we've got these little green tubules here. Those are the T-tubules or transverse tubules. And then you can see where we've got the synapse with the lower motor neuron of the somatic neuron. That's the neuromuscular junction. We have kind of a close-up view here, and you can see the motor end plate where it's kind of all wrinkled there. And that's where the nicotinic cholinergic receptors would be that would bind to the acetylcholine that would be released by that neuron. And then you can see how the sarcolemma is going to dive down deep inside the muscle cell with these T-tubules. Okay, and then in light blue, we've got the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That's actually the smooth ER, and that's going to store and release the calcium ions. So the light blue area, that's the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And then these little red things in there, those are all the mitochondria. So lots of mitochondria in your skeletal muscle cells because they need to make lots of ATP to power the contraction. And then these myofibrils, you've got lots of myofibrils packed in there, the little bundles of the contractile proteins. And these myofibrils will run the whole length of the muscle cell. And if we look up close, in the blue, you've got the thin filaments or the actin. And then in the orange, you've got the thick filaments or the myosin. And then this is just another view. I like this one because you can see the sarcolemma, the cell membrane on the outside, and then you can see how it dives down in, makes these yellow T-tubules here. And notice how they go deep down into the muscle cell and they actually will wrap around the myofibrils, and they run next to the smooth ER or the sarcoplasmic reticulum that is storing the calcium ions. And then we've got the myofibrils in there, the contractile proteins, you've got the thick filaments and then the thin filaments there. So the myosin and then the actin, and then we've got some mitochondria there to make the ATP.